Okay, so this is Brian Banks. In the fall of 2002, he was a 6'2", 250-pound junior linebacker in California. He was one of the most highly recruited football players in the country. He had just made a verbal commitment to play at USC. He was going on a full scholarship. Then came Winetta Gibson. One day at school, they were hanging out on the campus. She was a friend. She was 15. That afternoon, Brian was arrested leaving school, charged with rape and assault of Winetta. He was immediately put in jail, and his bail was set at $1 million. He was tried and convicted of the rape and assault. He was charged as an adult and faced 41 years in prison. But he took a plea deal that put him in prison for 5 years, and then he would serve 5 years tough probation and to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. So knowing what you know about Brian, how do you feel about him? He's a young African-American male who seems to have it all going for him. He's going off to college. He has NFL prospects before he even enters college. So he has that athlete persona surrounding him. What about his physique? He's huge. How would you feel about treating him? He's 6'2", 250. He's agile, he's quick, he's strong. And then what about the crime of rape? As females, how would you feel treating a man that you know is accused and convicted of rape and assault? And men, you have moms, you have sisters, you have girlfriends. You're working with a man who's accused and convicted of rape.
Yeah, so fair or not, there's a social stigma that's associated with being a prisoner. And this leads to problems when it prevents inmates from receiving the medical care that they're legally entitled to. And that's happening to thousands of inmates across the country. The general public forms these sweeping opinions on criminals, and they want the punishment to be severe. And in the same way, many people may question why these inmates are receiving medical care when they themselves may be without insurance and not receiving treatment. But as healthcare providers, it's important for us to treat these people the same way we treat any other patient who walks into our clinic. So the very first principle of the APTA Code of Ethics states that as physical therapists, we shall recognize our own biases and shall not discriminate against any individual based on social status. So it's important that we treat these individuals to the best of our ability and leave our own biases out of the treatment. But PT is just one of the services that they'll require when they're in prison. And many of the states hire private healthcare companies to provide care to prisoners. And these for-profit companies who generate billions of dollars in revenue are often hired to cut healthcare costs as low as possible. And this often comes at the expense of the inmates. Corizon Healthcare is the nation's leading provider of healthcare for prisons, and they serve over 350,000 inmates in 27 different states. And they've come under a lot of scrutiny lately for problems such as slowness to address the needs of patients with urgent medical emergencies and poor medical documentation. As a result, they've lost major contracts in 5 different states since 2012 alone. So as you can see, there are a lot of problems with the current system in place.
So there's obviously a lot of hesitancy for healthcare professionals to treat prisoners. Many of them have the mindset that these people had their chance to be a part of society and they messed it up and they got in trouble, so why should I help them now? This thought process, obviously, as Jared just talked about, leads to a lot of bias and stereotyping of them. And when those are combined with lack of financial resources and general lack of knowledge, it can lead to a lot of healthcare disparities. There's a lot of conditions that have a much higher prevalency in the jail community than they do in the general public. Just to list a few: diabetes, hypertension, asthma. HIV and AIDS is 2 times more prevalent in the jail cell community just because of the lack of high standard medical testing. Among inmates with a known medical problem, 14% of federal, 20% of state, and 68% of local inmates had received no medical examination at all from the start of their incarceration. And following a serious injury, 8% of federal, 12% of state, and 25% of local inmates were not seen by any medical personnel at all. So that's obviously a big problem. In 2009, the American Administration for Public Health published an analysis of healthcare in the prison system. They determined that many prison examination rooms often lacked basic medical equipment needed to perform examinations. They also found that many inmates who were in solitary confinement were placed there strictly due to overcrowded conditions, so there wasn't enough jail cells in normal, with open beds to place cells in normally. Another major issue is the lack of pharmaceutical intervention. 1 in 5 people in jail right now were on some sort of medical prescription at the time of their incarceration. But after their incarceration, 26% of federal, 29% of state, and 42% of local inmates had stopped giving their medication just due to pure neglect or lack of financial resource. An example of the lack of financial resource comes from the Bush administration. After his term in the White House, the Surgeon General who served under him came out and revealed that the Bush administration blocked the Surgeon General's report, which was called Call to Action on Corrections and Community Health. And the former Surgeon General stated that the report was blocked strictly because it would have revealed healthcare disparities in the prison systems, and they feared that it would have increased government spending on inmates, which is politically not a favorable option. So as we went through all this information, one thing that stood out to us is like, how could this even be legal in this day and age in our country? And what we found was as followed. All prisoners have a basic right to health care via the 8th Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual suffering, or cruel and unusual punishment. Sorry. But as that is interpreted by the federal courts, healthcare providers to the prison community cannot be held liable for malpractice or accidents that occur while they're treating their patients. So basically, it allows medical providers of prisoners to provide lower standard care either purposely or by accident and face no consequences.
So when it comes to, well, as Matt said, all inmates have a constitutional right to receive health care while they're serving time in prison and or jail. If they're unable to receive the treatment that they need while in the prison facility, they will be referred out to a clinic or organization that specializes and can perform the treatment that is required. When it comes to inmates, a study was performed that just looked at the common causes behind musculoskeletal injuries that we as PTs would treat in a prison setting. The first is overuse, is the overactive weightlifting culture that is prevalent in prisons. Second is inactivity, secondary to a sedentary lifestyle. And third is fighting and altercations between fellow inmates as well as with prison guards. The study also looked at the major injuries that we as physical therapists would treat. The first being low back pain and neck pain, and this can be due to overuse weightlifting. The second, it can also be due to unsupportive beds and surfaces in the facility, as well as a sedentary lifestyle. The second is fractures, and this is due to fighting as well as participation in different sporting activities. The third injury is soft tissue injury, and this is primarily caused by fighting within the prisons and jails. Lastly is treatment for elders. As inmates age, they begin to develop more chronic musculoskeletal issues, and this accounts for a large proportion of treatments that we as PTs would give to inmates. The last thing that the study looked at was barriers that we would encounter when treating inmates. The first being equipment. So as a PT, there's been a lot of research that shows that they have very limited access and use to the equipment that they would need. So that there affects the quality of intervention for different inmates. The second is security. As a PT, you have to go through extensive training and self-protection classes in order to treat inmates. Secondly, there's a lot of protocol that goes on in prison facilities involving security guards, security dogs, as well as body scans and checks to make sure that the use of equipment could not be harmfully turned on the therapists themselves. So that's kind of an overall look at what it would be like to treat inmates in a prison or jail setting.
So Brian Banks served his 5 years in prison. He came out and he served his 5 years in parole. In March of 2011, Juanetta wanted to meet with Brian. She ended up admitting that she had lied about the entire thing. Brian had spent 10 years of his life, 5 in prison, 5 out, serving for a crime he didn't commit. Brian never pressed charges against Juanetta. Brian went on to make it into the NFL. So knowing now what you know about Brian, how do your thoughts differ? Okay, if you had given him less treatment in prison because of what you thought he was, he wouldn't make it where he is today. So we all just want you to think long and hard about who these people are and what you can do to help them.